glad to be hosting today's presentation by Liao, who is a PhD student at Cambridge University and writes his PhD thesis pretty much on what he's going to talk to us today about. And it is something like the beginning of a Taiwan history week at our department, because Mr. Liao, you're not the only person to give a presentation on Taiwan history these days. Next week, I actually will give a presentation myself, which will also deal with the war and post-war situation of Taiwan. And I think this is a very, very good sort of concentration of topics, and also a very important concentration on Taiwan, which, as you know, is in a very precarious geopolitical situation at this moment. And I think this situation requires from us who are outside Taiwan to pay more attention to Taiwan and to pay more attention to what is going on in Taiwan. And of course, whenever we talk about Taiwan, and recently I had to give many interviews actually on Taiwan, although I'm not a Taiwan specialist as Mr. Liao is, people really don't understand what the historical sort of precondition or historical source is of what we are encountering today. They don't really understand what is going on, and they don't know which side to take because they don't know what the reason is for this very complicated relationship between the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China and Taiwan. And I think this tells us that we need to disseminate more and obviously very refined and very sophisticated knowledge about the situation in Taiwan in order to make the general public and of course our students and our colleagues understand more about the situation. So Mr. Liao, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And I'm very, very interested to hear your presentation because I just recently wrote a paper on Taiwan as a contact zone in which different powers meet in different constellations and have more of an influence on the situation on Taiwan than maybe the people living in Taiwan themselves. And for that reason, I find your topic extremely interesting and also very innovative. If I had known more about this issue, I would have written it into my paper because it goes very well with my topic and with my understanding of the situation in Taiwan. But I think it is something that has been totally overlooked so far, especially as people from outside East Asia tend to sort of focus on the situation of, for example, Taiwan, the People's Republic, Japan or Korea, and Europe or the US. And they very often neglect the internal complicated exchanges, collaborations, and precarious relationships between the different countries in East Asia. And I think for that reason, I'm thrilled to hear more about this. And I give you the floor or the video screen now. And I'd like to tell our audience and thank them for coming that please, if you have any questions while Mr. Liao is speaking, don't hesitate to write them into the chat. He will give a presentation of approximately 50 to 55 minutes, and we have time for questions and answers afterwards. So please don't be shy to raise your answers, and I will try to moderate the discussion afterwards and see that your answer will be, the question will be answered. Okay, so Mr. Liao, please go ahead, and thank you again for sharing your insights with us.
Okay, let me just share with my PowerPoint slides first before I start. Let's see. Okay, so everybody can now see my slides. Yeah. Okay. Let me turn into the full screen. Okay, so hello everyone. Good morning, everyone. I realize it's right before the lunchtime, so my name is Kohan, but you can always call me Ken. But before I begin, first of all, I would like to take this opportunity to show my gratitude to Dr. Lipinski, or Astrid, if I may, for her invitation to the Vienna Taiwan lecture series and her considerate and thorough discussions in the past months. I also want to thank, if I may, thank Susanna for such a fascinating introduction and opening. I truly appreciate that. And I realized that it's a shame that I couldn't make this lecture in person, as the pandemic doesn't allow me to do so. I only got my first AZ shot in early September and will not have my second one until the mid-November. And I'm also sorry to hear that the situation of the pandemic is getting a bit more serious when the weather cools down. In Vienna, as all of you today are staying home instead of being in the lecture room for this talk. But thanks to technology, we are all able to participate and interact via the internet. However, technology can sometimes become a double-edged sword. As every time before my talk, I always like to ask how many people have heard about the white group. In Mandarin, 白团, or in Japanese, 派団. I think it would be rather hard for me to have a count in this occasion, but I guess only a handful of people have heard about it. The white group was Chiang Kai-shek's secret Japanese military advisory group, consisting of more than 80 of former Imperial Japanese military officers who spent 20 years in Taiwan by helping retrain and reconstruct the Republic of China Armed Forces. I'll call it ROCAF henceforth, and drafting military plans for reconquering mainland China and reintroducing the wartime mobilization, including conscription and mobilization guidelines with the goal of defending Taiwan and retaking the mainland. So simply speaking, my research uses the white group as a case study to analyze the Imperial Japanese legacy in the post-war Taiwan and argues for its centrality of the post-1949 ROC's state building in Taiwan. But before we continue on the white group topic, I heard from Astrid that you guys have already seen the movie Detention before this martial law lecture series begins. Correct me if I'm wrong. I hope I'm not being a spoiler here. But I wonder what were the first impressions when seeing it? The uniforms, the restrictions on students' hairstyle, or those military education instructors and those slogans, as you can see on the slide? I'm not sure when was the last time that you guys went for scuba diving or or the free diving, but during my preparation for this talk, one day my friend sent me a bunch of pictures she took during her trip to Liao, the Green Island, last month. Here I'm showing you some pictures my friend showed, which provided me a precious vision under this pandemic. And of course, the sea turtle and the reef on the left, as you can see, which according to people look like former US President Donald Trump. What do you think? After this,
your slides do not move.
Sorry?
Sorry for this. Your slides do not move.
My slide doesn't move? Let me check.
No.
Because on my screen it's working.
Now we have your third slide, yes, and fourth slide.
Now,
we never saw your second one.
But we never saw the slide on yes, thank you. Now we see, right, the slide on Beihang.
Okay, no problem. I'll actually come back to slide 2 later during my talk, so no problem with the second slides. I want to move on a bit about, did you guys see Detention? This one?
Yes. No.
Okay. No? All right. So I assume all of you or most of you have seen the movie Detention before this town lecture series began. So I was trying to ask your first impression on when seeing this movie Detention. So I jumped all the way to this Green Island, the pictures that my friend showed me during her trip last month. This is highly connected to the theme of today, so bear me for a second. So on the left, let me see, I think it's working better if I'm not showing the full screen, right? You can follow my, if I'm trying to, do you see page 6? I want to make sure it's all working now. When I switch the page, are you guys following me?
Yes,
yeah, we can see
everything okay.
Okay, cool. Good. Then I'm not turning it to the full screen now. Okay, so on the left, according to people, it looks like the former US President Donald Trump. I don't know how you think, but after this originally a mushroom-shaped reef, people call it 石朗大香菇, literally means the huge mushroom of Shilang in Green Island, inclined to become what it looks like now after a typhoon struck a couple years ago. But okay, enough of under the sea shows. The reason why I want to bring the Green Island up is that this place was highly related to the martial law and the White Terror. So these pictures are taken from the Green Island prison. The area used to be the shelter during the Japanese rule. After the martial law declared in May 20th, 1949, many political dissidents were imprisoned there by the government, which was built in 1951. Over time, the prison came to symbolize political suppression. In the year of 2001, the Taiwan government opened the Green Island Human Rights Culture Park, in Mandarin, 绿岛人权文化园区, to commemorate those who had fought for Taiwan's freedom, democracy, and human rights. In 2014, the park was registered as the recognized cultural landscape by the Taidong County government. And later in the year of 2018, the ownership had moved to National Human Rights Museum, which established in the same year, and changed the name of the site to its current name, Green Island White Terror Memorial Park, in Mandarin, 白色恐怖绿岛纪念园区. So from the pictures, you get to see a lot of slogans in the prison. Different from the replicas you saw in the movie, those in the prison are the original ones. And from the slogans, despite the ROC state building and loyalty terms, including the ROC's founding father, Sun Yat-sen, the three principle of the people, you can also see that from the Chinese nationalist or the KMT, Kuomintang regime's perspective, Taiwan independence, the ideology which had gradually grown, especially after the February 28th or the 228 incident, 228事件, in 1947, had been marked as the fellow of the Chinese communists. In Mandarin and Taiwanese language, both independence and toxicity pronounced the same. For this reason, you see such slogan as 台独即台独, literally means Taiwan independence is toxic. So next time, when you have a chance to visit the Green Island, besides scuba diving or free diving, make sure to give a visit to the memorial park. I think it will help you imagine and think about how people of Taiwan have been struggling under the world's longest martial law period. I personally am visiting the Green Island 2 days after this lecture. I believe it will be an eye-opening moment and unforgettable experience during my visit to the memorial park. Now, before we move all the way back to the white group and the theme of today's talk, there is a few minutes video clip that I want to share with you. It was an introduction of Dr. Wu Mingyi's novel, The Stolen Bicycle, in Mandarin, 单车失窃记. It was the first ever novel by a Taiwanese writer to be long-listed for the Man Booker International Prize of 2018. And the video was about the conversation between Dr. Wu Mingyi and Professor Barack Kushner, my supervisor from Cambridge, which was held at the Taiwan Representative Office in the UK in summer 2018. I want you to think about your impressions on the video clip. Let's have a look, and I need help from Raphael to play the first video clip, please.
这个言行当中，他都认为日本制造的东西是全世界最好的。接着我又在一系列的书籍里面读到，原来脚踏车跟战争有非常密切的关系。在很早的时候，欧洲就已经使用脚踏车来进行作战。后来我又在2次大战战史里面读到，原来脚踏车在亚洲战场里面也曾经出现过。当时日军跟中国部队在南亚的战争，其中一个最重要的战场就是缅甸。这条不可思议的道路是由中国军开发的，用来运送物资到中国的这个后方。在一场战争里面，他们俘虏了 一些缅甸军的大象，在击败日军之后，为了把这个象征胜利的战利品运回中国，所以这几头大象走过了刚刚各位看到的那条不可思议的道路。这些大象在这几千公里的长路里面，一头一头的倒下，最后有3头来到台湾，其中一头最不可思议的大象到了台北市最重要的一个动物园——圆山动物园，活了下来，成为世界上最长寿的大象。这头大象在全世界非常知名的，不只是因为它的长寿，还因为它到60几岁的时候都还在狂暴期里面，也就是一般我们讲的大象只有在发情的时候会进入了一个生理状态。因为大象的记忆非常的久，所以我作为一个小说家，我认为他忘不了那场战争。各位到台北市立动物园去，还可以看到林旺这头大象的标本。台湾的小朋友已经忘记这段战争，而叫林旺爷爷。这就是这本小说，它融合了台湾的自然史、战争史，还有我自己的家族记忆。Thank you.
So not only is Dr. Wu a novelist and teaches Taiwanese literature and creative writing in Taiwan, but he also illustrated his book as well, which is beautiful. And as you've seen some of the illustrations of the butterflies as well. And I'm just wondering, like, is there anything you don't do? Like, are you going to write a symphony we should know about?
So let's continue. So apparently he's not going to write a symphony, but I always look forward to his new novels and the shows or movies based on his work. If you are interested in the history of Taiwan martial law, you can never miss the show based on Dr. Wu Mingyi's novel, The Magician on the Skywalk, in Mandarin, 天桥上的魔术师. It's recently on Netflix, but I'm not sure if you can watch the series from your European account. So other than the unbeatable bicycle brigade, which played a crucial role in the Pacific War. Oh, by the way, the brigades were trained in Taiwan before their departure to the Southeast Asian battlefields, as the Imperial Japanese army attempted to fight a similar jungle and weather condition. And colonial Taiwan served the best experiment and training ground for the Japanese Empire. So other than the bicycles, what features do you see through the story of the elephant Ling Wang? Don't you feel Ling Wang's tangled yet intriguing story nicely delineates the trans-war history of Taiwan? A Japanese Burmese elephant captured by the ROC army under the command of General Sun Liren. Remember his name, because he will be mentioned more often than you think throughout this talk. And the elephant was moved with General Sun Liren when the latter was sent to Taiwan to train the new troops in 1947. So from 1952, the elephant was moved to Taipei Zoo in Yuanshan and became every child's grandpa Ling Wang. Okay, so I want you to look at and grasp the trans-war history of Taiwan by zooming out on the scope. Because looking at the history by mere Chinese nationalist or ROC or Sino-centric perspective can barely provide an objective or a comprehensive analysis and interpretation of the post-war Taiwan history. Furthermore, like the quotes you saw in the second slides. Now let me move back to the second slides. I want you to read those quotes. The afterlife, the legacy or the continuity of the Empire of Japan actually played a bigger role than we can all think of. So let me move back to slide 12. So, well, this is from a poster of the map of the World War Front stated events before the end of World War II from my alma mater, the University of Toronto Library, which I coincidentally got from a night market in Tainan. So make sure you spend some time on the poster booths when you go to a night markets in Taiwan, because you'll never know what treasure you will be digging. Okay, so let's move all the way back to the critical years of 1949 and the early 1950s. As you can see on the slide, the New York Times Magazine of September 1950 that I found in the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, it was estimated that without the American intervention, Taiwan and its KMT regime would be liberated by the People's Liberation Army, or the PLA, within 1 year. And when you look at the pictures on the top right corner, the captions are too small to read, but here you can see they show the island fortifications. This concrete pillbox is one of the numerous strong points along Formosa's coastline. Japanese-built fortifications provide secondary interior defense positions. The military officer standing on the pillbox was again General Sun Liren of the Taiwan Defense Command by Chiang Kai-shek in 1949. As Sun will be mentioned again as he later became a victim of the White Terror under the early years of the martial law due to the power struggle within the KMT. There is a consensus among the historians that it was the Korean War that triggered the US intervention in the Taiwan Strait, which in turn led to a signing of the Mutual Defense Treaty between the US and ROC in 1954. It accidentally gave the nationalist state rooted in Taiwan its permanent shape. However, before the Korean War and the arrival of the US Military Assistance Advisory Group, here I call MAAG henceforth, it was the White Group that helped Chiang Kai-shek and the war-worn ROCAF to defend Taiwan and attempt to retake mainland China. Just like the hidden information from the captions of the picture, the Japanese influence or Imperial Japanese legacy on the nationalist state building and developmental state forged after 1949 was more crucial than we think. So in today's talk, I'm going to introduce the role and impact of the White Group played and brought to the KMT and the ROC's nation building in Taiwan under the early years of martial law. And with a preliminary attempt to discuss whether the reintroduction of the wartime mobilization system in Taiwan should be considered as the protection for people of Taiwan from the invasion of the PRC, or the accomplice or the perpetrator of Chiang Kai-shek's authoritarian rule on this accidental island nation. So these are from the Seattle International Intelligencer on April 16, 1950, which shows you again General Sun Liren's role on the defense of Taiwan. But before introducing the White Group's mission in Taiwan, I would like to talk about Chen Chen's mission in Taiwan in 1949. It still remains debatable between historians about when exactly Taiwan became Chiang Kai-shek's final destination for strategic transition. Many would say strategic transition in Mandarin, 转进, means retreat. Yes, it is retreat. However, the term also emphasizes its temporariness and always seeks possible counterattack, as it is highly intertwined to the legitimacy of the KMT's rule in Taiwan and the ROC's representative of China in the global diplomatic arena. Some argue 1948, others argue later in 1949, and that Taiwan was not the only options for retreat or exile. However, from Chiang Kai-shek's diary, I'll call it CKSD henceforth. In 1946, we can see that after his visit in Taiwan, Chiang had a good impression of Taiwan's fundamental infrastructure built by the Japanese, and more importantly, the island remained clear of communism. Chiang Kai-shek appointed General Chen Chen as the new provincial governor of Taiwan 3 weeks before his resignation on January 21st, 1949, as a result of pressure from America and the Guangxi clique, and mainly due to the recent military defeat in North and Northeast China. So Chen Chen is a loyal subordinate and comrade of Chiang Kai-shek since the mid-1920s. He was regarded by the US as one of the few generals in whom Chiang Kai-shek had absolute trust. For this reason, it was assumed that his appointment to Taiwan revealed Chiang Kai-shek's plan of making the island his home base. Back to the previous slide. So the appointment of Chen Chen as Taiwan's new provincial governor was crucial. There were 3 reforms that allowed Taiwan to become a strong anti-communist base of the nationalist regime, along with the land reforms and enhancement of the Taiwan's economic autonomy by issuing the new Taiwan dollar in Mandarin 新台币 to replace the old banknotes with the backing of the gold reserves stored in Taiwan to cut the monetary ties with the chaotic Chinese mainland currency. On May 20th, 1949, Chen Sheng declared martial law on Taiwan and stopped the flood of the mainlanders into Taiwan, except Keelung, Kaohsiung, and Magong of Penghu Island that were under the control of the Taiwan Garrison Command. The rest of the port cities were closed for security reasons. And in October 1949, the Taiwan provincial government started the physical examination of men who were born in 1928 and 1929, and announced the implementation of conscription, which would begin the next year. The first term of recruitment began in January 1950. Within 5 years, Taiwanese were conscripted again. However, instead of the Japanese total war against the alliance, Taiwan this time involved in the Chinese Civil War. So Chiang Kai-shek listed the reasons for the KMT's failure in the Chinese Civil War in his diary on March 28, 1949. Along with the failure of diplomacy, mainly the relations with the US, clique problems and the breakdown of party machine and flawed monetary policies, failure of military education was also listed. Chiang further elaborated on the defeat in his diary in October by stating that among several causes for the recent failure, the collapse of the military was the major one. The collapse could be attributed to unsound education and personnel management in the military. The military academies, except the Air Force, the Army and Navy had few academies which successfully retreated to Taiwan in the early 1950s. In total, there were only 18 academies and training groups that were moved to Taiwan. Most of them lacked the capacity to admit students and offer lectures. Therefore, the most urgent thing was to reconstruct and retreated war-worn nationalist troops in order to solve the root problems that caused the great failure of the KMT. Upon Chiang's earlier arrival in Kaohsiung in May 1949, he appointed an ad hoc group of 10 loyal men to study measure to reorganize the party. He proclaimed that the KMT must be a revolutionary democratic party instead of a pure democratic party. At the meeting of this KMT reform group on July 6, 1949. This reorganization reaffirmed the Leninist and non-democratic structure of the party. Now, you might wonder why I put a game official's picture here. I always tend to use the penalty flag to describe what the temporary provisions effective during the period of national mobilization for suppression of the communist rebellion, such a long term, it's in Mandarin called 动员戡乱时期临时条款, enacted on May 10, 1948, and martial law, of course, 戒严, meant to post-1949 Taiwan. A penalty flag is a yellow cloth used in several field sports, including American football and lacrosse, by game officials to identify and sometimes mark the location of penalties or infractions that occurred during regular play. So like the game time being paused when the umpire throwing in penalty flag, you can imagine the ROC Constitution ratified by the KMT during the Constituent National Assembly session on December 25th, 1946 in Nanjing was frozen, if not nullified, upon the ongoing civil war with the Chinese Communist Party. The country was under division. So ever since the ROC's central government relocated to Taipei, it had been seeking an opportunity to recapture mainland China by military means. But how? And by whom? Being abandoned by Washington before the eruption of the Korean War, Chiang Kai-shek had no one to rely on but his former enemy, the former Imperial Japanese military officers. So having lost the mainland China, the priority for Chiang Kai-shek was to consolidate his authority, reform the collapsed ROCAF, and ensure the security of Taiwan. So on 10th of September 1949, that's 3 weeks before the establishment of the People's Republic of China, or PRC, in Beijing, a contract exchange took place in Tokyo between the representative of the ROC government, General Cao Sicheng, the chief of the first section for military affairs in the Nationalist Chinese mission in Tokyo, and 14 representatives of the former Japanese military officers, including former Imperial Japanese Army General Okamura Yasuji, who was the last commander of the Japanese expeditionary force in China and declared not guilty by one of the last nationalist military tribunals to adjudicate Japanese war crimes, and was sent back to Japan in the early 1949. The group was called Baituan, White Group. This was because the Chinese name of the leader of the White Group, the former Imperial Japanese Army Major General Tomita Naosuke, was Bai Hongliang. The Chinese word for white is Bai and group is Tuan. So Bai Tuan literally means the White Group or the Bai Hongliang's group. The other reason for choosing the White Group was that white was in opposition to red, which represents communism. So converting from Chinese to Japanese, the group was also known as Paidan. The first two White Group members who arrived in Taiwan in early November 1949 were Tomita and Aratake Kunimitsu, the former Imperial Japanese Army captain. The first mission for them was to go to the front line in Chongqing of the Sichuan province. They shared their observations with Chiang Kai-shek, who also went to Chongqing a couple of days after their arrival. So Chiang Kai-shek in his diary wrote down his thoughts on Tomita, met with Bai Hongliang, his intelligence on the enemy and judgment on landform of the front line were quite accurate. On the 20th of November, Tomita and Aratake went to Nanchuan, the city east of Chongqing, and met with the commander Luo Guangwen, who was a classmate of Hu Lian in the Whampoa Military Academy and the graduate of the Imperial Japanese Army Academy. Based on Aratake's observation, the troops were struggling with the morale and commander's will to fight was very weak. Indeed, one of the root causes for the total defeat of the Nationalist Army in the Chinese Civil War was poor state of their military morale. This was mainly due to the factional military and politics, which served as a double-edged sword for Chiang Kai-shek. On one hand, Chiang Kai-shek skillfully manipulated of the factional military and politics enabled him to survive as the dominant figure in Chinese politics in the 1930s. However, on the other hand, the factional politics and military had made the KMT lose its revolutionary spirit and become a status quo party after the North expedition and the purging of the Chinese communists. This hindered the Chiang Kai-shek from achieving genuine power and eventually became a vital problem that nearly ruined the nationalist regime in 1949. And General Luo Guangwen surrendered to the PLA after his defeat in Sichuan in early December. The nationalist government formally relocated to Taipei on December 8th. However, it was too late for the White Group to help the nationalist army to resist the PLA in the mainland. Since then, their missions became the defense of Taiwan and assistance in the plan to retake the mainland. The goal of the White Group was to help the ROC-AF retake the mainland by retraining the military, drafting military plans, and mobilization guidelines and offering military education of the ROC military officers in Taiwan. For this reason, in a meeting for the military education reform on 21st of February 1950, Chiang Kai-shek instructed 3 principles which were elaborated into 5 points that stressed the importance of psychological education, shorter training duration, joint military operations, and regarding military academies as core. This also explained why the White Group was formed and the military classes offered by it were short-term. In addition, learning from the lessons of falling short in joint operation between the Army, Navy, and Air Force in the battles against the PLA, Chiang Kai-shek expressed his wish that the ROC military officers could learn the ability and spirit from those Japanese military officers. He studied abroad and went to military school in Japan in his 20s. He well noticed that without American intervention in World War II, the ROC-AF wouldn't have achieved the victory in the end. He believed that from the training offered by the White Group, the 6 inner characteristics, namely responsibility, obedience, service, sacrifice, creativity, and discipline can be seen. Those were the soul of Japan, the so-called Bushido spirit. Chiang Kai-shek deeply understood the importance of letting his military officers receive Japan's pre-war Army War Academy college education offered by those defeated Japanese military officers. He did not devalue them, instead saw them as a savior of his military. So there were several reasons why the White Group was formed. First, Okamura's expertise in China could enable him to repay hatred with kindness and salvage the post-war decline of Okamura's prestige and power. Second, considering the socio-economic status of the Japanese former imperial soldiers in the penurious early post-war Japan, the job offered a good income for them and their families. It was estimated that the paying was almost 6 times of a ROC minister back in 1950s. Third, ideological passion also reason for those former Japanese officers' effort to keep former colony, i.e. Taiwan, out of the hands of the communists. This had been a supposed goal of the policy of the Japanese Empire. More importantly, a combination of military necessity, ideological alignment, and desire to bring to bear the tactics of a battle-hardened and formidable enemy familiar with war in China also explain Chiang Kai-shek's hire of the White Group. Let alone Japanese soldiers were the very only ones who had experience of landing or invading China from the seas. This helped the making of the military plans for recapturing Chinese mainland. However, the existence of the White Group not only led to complaints from General Sun Liren, who was dissatisfied about the Japanese military officers, taking away a large number of military commanders from his units for 3 to 4 months for the training program, but also the MAAG's concerns. Learning from the failure in the Chinese Civil War, Chiang understood the importance of building a model army that could be the main force of retaking the mainland. For this reason, in the spring of 1950, he designated the 32nd Division stationed at Hukou in Hsinchu County, which was being viewed as the best ground force unit in Taiwan, for the White Group members to train and experiment their military theories on. Ideally, Chiang Kai-shek planned to let the ROCAF incorporate both American and Japanese system with the external, such as a finance weapon-wise assistance from the former, and the internal, such as ethos and institution-wise form from the latter. That explained the reason why Chiang Kai-shek purposely had the MAAG and the White Group to train the 67th Army and the 32nd Division, respectively, as a model army. But the MAAG and the US Embassy realized that Chiang used the White Group to counterbalance the strong MAAG influence and checkmate General Sun Liren. Given the fact that Sun earned strong support from the US and was once a candidate for Washington to replace Chiang Kai-shek as the leader of Taiwan before the eruption of the Korean War, Chiang Kai-shek skillfully adopted this divide and rule policy by using the White Group. Sun Liren also opposed the surveillance instituted by the Chiang Kai-shek's son, Jiang Jingguo, when he initiated Soviet-style military structure. Sun Liren was later charged with conspiracy in 1955 and spent his last 30 years under the virtual house arrest until the death of Jiang Jingguo in 1988. Until the lift of martial law in 1987, the number of victims for political dissidents was estimated to be at least 100,000. This was not limited to civilians, as Sun Liren and more than 300 of his close subordinates were placed under arrest, and many more were relieved of their duties due to the power struggle in military. Sun Liren's reputation was cleared in 2001 after a government investigation into a purported court attempt. In fact, Chiang Kai-shek also used the higher ranking class taught by the White Group to contain the Chen Chen's clique. For instance, General Hu Lian, who belonged to Chen Chen's clique, was marked unqualified after 3 months of training under higher ranking classes. Chiang changed General Hu Lian's commander with officers from different cliques during Hu Lian's 1 month extension training. Chiang Kai-shek not only used the white group to train his military, but contain and regroup any clique that was potentially threatening his authority in Taiwan. Here, Chiang Kai-shek used the white group. Chiang Kai-shek's use of the white group remained important in its depiction of the rapprochement between the nationalists and Japan in pursuit of the common enemy, the Chinese communists. But its involvement in the KMT's factional struggle made the white group role unique. The mobilization was new to nationalist regime. During the Republican era in China, the military consisted of two components, namely the military officers from the elite level and soldiers based on press gangs. However, people of Taiwan were well experienced with the conscription and wartime mobilization under Japanese colonial rule. For this reason, Chiang was determined to introduce the Japanese mobilization system with the assistance of the white group. So from the 8th to the 20th February 1952, the first mobilization exercise in Taiwan history began. With the participation of the 32nd Division, the white group also helped drafted the mobilization system for Taiwan. Here, the anti-communist and anti-Soviet mobilization campaign guideline was passed and implemented in April 1952. As it was stated in the guideline, the military mobilization was considered as the core of all mobilizations, including political, economic, social, and cultural mobilizations. For this reason, all the human, material, and financial resources should be adapted to military requirement when necessary. This explains how people of Taiwan were situated under a total mobilization with complete guideline that was created through the assistance of Japanese. In other words, if we consider mobilization system as part of the ROC's institutional accumulation, if not nation building in Taiwan, in order to retake mainland China, it was with assistance of Japanese, as this Japanese legacy was continued under the context of the Chinese Civil War and the Cold War in East Asia. So Chiang Kai-shek ordered the white group to go underground in July 1952, due to strong pressure from the US. For this reason, the Yuanshan training camp was shut down, and the white group staff reduced from 76 to 30. However, with Chiang's persistence, the training program resumed in Shipai in November under the pretext of conducting research. The white group operated for another 17 years until the last 4 Japanese instructors closed their programs and returned to Japan. The white group kept playing an important role through the 2 Taiwan Strait crises from 1954 to 1955 and in 1958, and the making of the Guam War Plan, or Guam Plan, Guam Jihua in Mandarin, in 1953, which later became the fundamental of the Project National Glory in Mandarin, Guoguang Jihua, the largest military plan for retaking mainland China from the early 1960s to 1970s. Here, I want to show everybody a 1-minute video clip of a documentary film released last year. It's about the Guam Plan. So again, I need assistance from Raphael, please.
1953年6月11日，白团参与拟定的反攻大陆计划“光计划”，它是期许反攻的速度像光速一般。
我们一贯信义，不以日本人民为敌。刚顺领事对我们很感激，他也从中帮忙，去能不洪亮。
为什么他要聘用百团？全世界没有一个国家比日本人更加了解国共的问题。
本人はやりたいんだけども、反攻計画は続くか。使命として蒋介石の軍隊が台湾から大陸に戻る。中学に入るぐらいまでは九州へ出張してるっていうことで、てっきり台湾じゃなくて九州にいると思ってたんですね。
もうお部屋いっぱいぐらいに地図をなんかやってましたよね。
ただ台湾との関係があるようなことが。
で父の日記を見て。 それから大体分かってる。
To our slides. I was very lucky to have private conversation with the director, Mr. Xu Mingchun, and the executive producer, Li Gang, who's the younger brother of the director Li An and Li, at the end of the movie. Of course, the plan had never been executed eventually. However, we had a consensus on why Chiang Kai-shek, despite Washington's non-intervention stance before the eruption of the Korean War, deeply understood that the Japanese were the very only one who had experience of invading or landing mainland China from the seas. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese had developed thorough understanding of the southern China. This also explains why the counterattack was planned to initiate from Fujian and Guangdong province. As the leader of the White Group, Bai Hongliang, or Tomita Naosuke, was the chief of the staff of the Japanese 23rd Army based in Guangdong by the end of World War II. Another thing I want to emphasize is that the person in charge for the White Group in Taiwan was Peng Mengqi. For those people who have studied the 228 incident of 1947, might hear of him. On one hand, he was the commander at the Kaohsiung fortress during the 228 incident. He was named as one of the people responsible for the deaths of many innocent Taiwanese as he ordered a massacre in Kaohsiung, which later earned him a nickname, the Kaohsiung Butcher. On the other hand, his suppression and loyalty to the KMT in the incident totally won the heart of Chiang Kai-shek. This also explains why Peng Mengqi became one of the key roles in Chiang's clique in the post-1949 era in Taiwan. He was later promoted to be the ROC Chief of Staff, the commander of the army, and the ambassador of the ROC to Japan, and witnessed the recognition of Taiwan from Japan in the year of 1972. Okay. So the most significant contribution that the White Group made was military education. It was estimated that over 10,000 higher-ranking nationalist officers had attended the White Group's training program during 20 years of their existence. Many of the students later became the key men in the ROCAF. More importantly, the war mobilization system reintroduced by the White Group remilitarized people of Taiwan, this time under the nationalist rule, which enabled the ROCAF to have well-organized military recruitment system and mobilization guidelines to be based on. So these were the key elements that the nationalist military fell short during the Republican era in mainland China. The complete conscription, mobilization system, a reserve military officer system, and military training guidelines with the assistance of the White Group are still playing a crucial role. And they are still in use even today in Taiwan. So the entangled relations between Taiwan, Japan, and China developed further when the new ruler, the ROC, hired the former colonizer, Japanese, to help train their military and remobilize the people of the ex-colony, Taiwan, for another 20 years after the dismantling of the Japanese Empire in the end of World War II. By introducing history of the early years of the post-war Taiwan and the White Group's first stage of mission on the island from 1949 to 1952, this talk helps us better understand how the Japanese legacy, that is the wartime mobilization system, continue to play a crucial role in institutional accumulation of the Chinese nationalist regime in Taiwan. It also shows us how the defeated KMT regime, through the assistance of the White Group, remobilized Taiwanese people and enabled Taiwan to become its final anti-communist stronghold to resist communist China. This history enables us to comprehend how the post-1949 ROC in Taiwan became the state it is now. More importantly, it allows us to consider the possibility of bridging the divergence between the Taiwanese and the ROC/Chinese nationalist historical perspective which might lead to a pursuit of consensus among people in Taiwan on how this de facto independent country has come to the current status quo and position it is today. Last but not least, it provides insight into Taiwan's contemporary geopolitical status, which is undoubtedly at the symbolic crossroad again, upon the continuing escalation of current US-China confrontation that might lead to a new Cold War. So in conclusion, it still requires more research on whether the white group play a role as an accomplice of Chiang Kai-shek's authoritarian rule in Taiwan under the early martial law years. Nevertheless, they indirectly helped complete the wartime mobilization system in Taiwan, which gave inevitable impact to Taiwanese society, which people of Taiwan suffered more than 3 decades of curtailed civil and political freedoms for the sake of recapturing mainland China under the martial law period. And thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to a further discussion during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Liao. This was a very, very interesting presentation full of new insights. And I must admit that I wanted to add something to your introduction at the beginning of the lecture. And now I will do it because I forgot earlier on, because you also mentioned on your last slide that you actually received a prize for your outstanding research, and which is the prize given by the Taiwan the Association of Taiwan Studies in Europe, and it was quite recently in April of this year. And I think after listening to your presentation, we very well understand why you received this Young Scholar Award by the European Association for Taiwan Studies.
Thank you very much.
I hope that there will be many questions, and for people sort of to just digest what they heard and come up with their questions. Please allow me to raise one question, very simple question, and to give one comment to what you just presented to us. So let me start with the question. So how did you come about the sources that revealed all this history that you laid out in front of us to you? Did you find the sources in the Hoover Institution in Stanford, or did you find most of the sources in Taiwan? And how can you explain that? Obviously, if I'm informed correctly, no one before you ever really did in-depth research on this very important facet of history on Taiwan. And the comment which I would like to make is the following. I had a PhD student when I was still professor in Heidelberg more than 20 years ago, who is called Michael Meyer, and he is actually a historian of economic history of China, and he wrote his PhD thesis on the modernization effort on Taiwan after 1949, and linked it to the modernization plans of the KMT back in 1927. In this context, he has a very, very interesting chapter, which of course is written in German and not in English, on what Chen Yi actually did after 1949, before Chen Cheng was actually established as the governor of Taiwan. And why am I telling you this? Because I think that some of the things you actually sort of said that they were reform plans by Chen Cheng were actually reform plans by Chen Yi. And I think maybe that would be important for you to sort of look into the fact that Chen Yi was suddenly pushed out of office and actually criticized quite heavily for what I understand was a policy of making Taiwan more autonomous from the mainland in terms of economic policies. I think it is not directly related to what you're telling us here, but it's indirectly related. And of course, maybe you would have to sort of rephrase a little bit the period under Chen Cheng in order to sort of not to give him credit for something that actually Chen Yi did. This would be my comment. And so just for the easy question, where did you find the sources?
Thank you very much, Susanna. Thank you very much for the precious comment. Yes, actually Chen Yi's role is bigger than we all thought. So in order to give a talk for this Taiwan lecture series, I kind of caught in the middle because the earlier part of the paper that received the European Association of Taiwan Study first prize this year, I tried to connect with the early post-war period all the way from the year of 1945 to the early 1950s. And I also mentioned about the role of Chen Yi. And we can never overlook the robust tie between Chen Yi and Japan, given that his wife was Japanese. So that's a very good comment. I really appreciate that. And also back to your very first question. Yes, primary source. I've been consulting quite a number of archives. That's all historians need to do. So Hoover Institution for sure. The curator of the East Asian Archive, Dr. Lin Xiaoting, who released a groundbreaking book titled "In Accidental State," 意外的国度, back in 2016. So there's an abundant resource, a primary source, including the ones from the White Group members, are stored in Hoover in Stanford, and the other archives, including a historical Academia Historica, 国史馆 in Taipei, and Yasukuni Kaiko Bunko. It's a Yasukuni library, and there is the vice leader of the White Group. He's called Hongo Ken in Mandarin, Ben Xiangjian. He personally donated 11 to 12 photo albums that he took during his years in Taiwan. So including those I share with you on my slides, those pictures were actually taken from the photo albums. And I believe there's a very precious and abundant source that other historians can dig into, as the pictures can sometimes reveal or tell more story than the words can do. So yes, so abundant resource from Tokyo as well.
Yes, thank you very much. That is very interesting. In the meantime, we have a few questions. So the first one, and if you allow me to just read it out, Ms. Cheng, is from Isabel Cheng, and she thanks you for the presentation and says, could I ask two questions? How did different services respond to the White Group's training, Army, Navy, Air Force? And secondly, how much was the White Group's drafting of the National Mobilization Plan retained by the later implementation of the National Mobilization Plan? So she's talking about the difference between the White Group's National Mobilization Plan and the later drafted National Mobilization Plan. So what's the difference between the two? And how did the different services react to the training?
Okay. And it's very good to see Isabel here. I see some old faces. So good to answer her questions. So first of all, I think the White Group's mission or their military educations offered in Taiwan during the 20 years were mainly focused on the army. This also explains why Chiang Kai-shek actually designated the 32nd Division based in Hukou, Hsinchu County, for the White Group members to experiment and to practice those military theories on. And so later in the mid 1960s, when the total number of the White Group member was reduced to under 5, the leader, Tomita Naosuke, Bai Hongliang, was still teaching in the Army Academy. So I would say that the White Group's mission or military education offer were mainly focusing on the the education to those military officers from the army. Of course, the higher level education classes incorporate all the ROC AF for those mid-ranking and higher ranking officers. But for the training, joint military operations and those practice of military mobilization were mainly focused on the army, as far as I know. And for the second question, I think actually the framework of the this wartime mobilization was accidentally found within the military of ROCAF when they brought all the way from mainland China to Taiwan after 1949, and that framework was based on a Japanese guideline book that they acquired when defeating the Imperial Japanese soldiers. So, of course, 国防部, the Ministry of National Defense, asked those translators to quickly translate all those guidelines all the way from Japanese language to Mandarin. I think that's the very basic framework of the later national mobilization plan for the post-1949 ROC on Taiwan. However, there is one huge difference in between the Japanese version and the ROC version, is that there's a loyalty, the principle of the loyalty to the highest commander, that is President Chiang Kai-shek. And from the Japanese tradition, there is no such guideline for the loyalty to the highest commander. So according to the articles from the White Group members back in the 1980s, they say that they have to study and then to kind of remake these principles to put it into the so-called the national mobilization plan for the ROC on Taiwan. I think that's the biggest difference in between the Japanese and the ROC on Taiwan versions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much.
The question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yet another question by Sandra Milch. Had the members of the White Group any official connections to Japanese institutions while being stationed in Taiwan?
Yes, I can say almost all of them, all of the White Group members were pre-war students or graduates from the military academy. Chiang Kai-shek himself studied abroad in Japan. He went to a military school. It's not the army college in Japan, and in his 20s. So he deeply understands the virtue of those Japanese military training and education. So one of the requirement or precondition of acquiring, recruiting those White Group members was that they must be the graduates of those pre-war Japanese military academy. That's very important for not only Chiang Kai-shek's requirement, but for the whole ROCAF's reconstruction and retraining.
Mm-hmm. And did they still preserve their relationship with the Japanese army while being in Taiwan?
Some of them, when they finished their missions in Taiwan, they returned to Japan. Yeah. They joined the self-defense force. So they became, some of them became the instructors in the academy. Yes, so there must be a tie, under table tie maybe, because back in the time it's a secret military advisory group of, despite the fact that the official level from both Japan and Taiwan side deeply understand they have such a deal in between. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Astrid Lipinski wants to know what language was the language of instruction. What role did Japanese play, and do you know whether or not Chiang Kai-shek actually spoke Japanese?
Chiang Kai-shek himself spoke very lousy Japanese. He was not a very outstanding student when he was studying in Japan. Among, if I still remember, among 60 or 50 graduates, he was ranked 55. It's the bottom 5 students. And his classmates, Zhang Qun, who later played a very key role in president office, was a top student in the same grade. He was a top 5 student, and Zhang Qun spoke a fascinating, fluent Japanese language. And what language could Baituan officer using? They all taught in Japanese language, and then there's a a translator who translated for the students right away.
Okay.
And were Taiwanese so willing because it was common language? Well, by the end of the war, especially the wartime generation Taiwanese, they speak fluent Japanese language because it's their official language back at the time, right? As Taiwan was part of the Japanese Empire. So yes, from those articles from the white group members, some of them spoke Japanese with the servants or the civilians on the street in Taiwan. Yes, so I would say Japanese language was a common language between white group members and some of the Taiwanese native people.
Yeah, but do I remember correctly? I think that after 1949, Japanese was forbidden as a language of common usage in Taiwan. You were not supposed to use it on an everyday basis, right? So this was also a special situation that these people sort of inside these academies were obviously, if they could speak Japanese, they would speak Japanese with the instructors, right?
And in political science, we call it state building of the KMT regime in Taiwan by de-Japanize their pre-war memory of Japanese legacy, and then synthesize to install a alien regime, including all the culture, costume, and languages, etc., etc. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Next question is related to the relationship between Taiwan, Japan, and the US, because you hinted at the US exerting certain kinds of pressures on Taiwan, and they obviously were not so happy with the presence of the Baituan on Taiwan. Could you elaborate a little bit more on this US, Taiwan, Japan relationship in this period?
Yes, the US, or the MAAG, the American Military Advisory Group, totally opposed the idea that Chiang Kai-shek hired those Japanese military officers to train the ROCAF. Simply speaking, it's logically, American military consider the Japanese military as a defeated one. So they don't believe that weapon-wise or institutional-wise is that Japanese education provide any virtue to reconstruct those ROCAF. However, when the white group went underground ever since 1952 to the Shipai research group, they secretly drafted the plan, as you can see, the Guang plan, the plan of light. So you can see my captions in red. There are two plans, Plan A and Plan B, 甲岸乙岸. You see, the Plan A is that expected ROCAF to counterattack alone. That means, first of all, Americans still hold a very strong stance against this counterattack, especially ever since the signing of the Mutual Defense Treaty in the year of 1954. All Washington wished was that to maintain the status quo, with ROC controlling over Taiwan, PRC controlling over mainland China, and no non-intervention in between, no escalation of tension across the Taiwan Strait. That's their highest principle. But you also see a Plan B. That means 2 years of preparation and see how international situation develops. That's actually a very strong idea from Chiang Kai-shek, because he believed that the international situation can actually play a very crucial role for his plan of returning to mainland China. Because if you look back in the year of 1927, 1928, nobody had hope on this North Expeditionary War against the Northeast warlord in mainland China. However, the whole situation changed with the involvement of the Japanese Imperial Army and all those strong powers from the West. And that's the occasion that provided Chiang Kai-shek a perfect chance to nominally unify the whole China. So that's a very strong notion in Chiang Kai-shek's mind, that he was waiting and see how this international situation develops. So of course, I think the higher level of American military knows what Chiang Kai-shek and those Japanese military officers were trying to draft. You know, they believe that Chiang Kai-shek was probably back at the time the very only ones who still believe there is a very big chance of returning to China. And there's such a strong belief from Chiang Kai-shek himself. So, but of course, it's a secret draft, military draft plan from those White Group members, and it's a secret in between Japan and Taiwan, the ROC on Taiwan. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we know that Chiang Kai-shek in many instances was not totally in line with the US. And we can very well understand if the US wants to preserve the status quo, then of course they would not allow for any of these plans to recover the mainland to ever become true, you know. Interestingly, the same is true for the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. So the People's Republic of China got prepared to take over Taiwan several times, but I believe that's one of the reasons why finally Mao decided to split with the Soviet Union is because Khrushchev always made Mao's plans impossible for taking over Taiwan. Yeah. And it is interesting that we are now in a constellation which is maybe even much more dangerous than back in the late 1950s or early 1960s with regards to a military move towards Taiwan from the point of view of the People's Republic of China. But it was quite clear that the Soviet Union actually hindered China from taking these steps, just as the US tried to hinder Chiang Kai-shek and the Republic of China to recover the mainland. Ms. Hell, you wanted to ask a question in person. I don't know whether you saw my message, but would you please turn on your camera and your microphone and ask your question in person?
Yes, exactly. Sorry, I'm so tired of digital formats that if there would be only possibility to ask it with the voice, I would do that.
Yes, that's totally okay. No problem. Go
please,
ahead.
Please.
As you said at the beginning of your presentation, even professional historians, even professional sinologists, and even professional historians in history of China would hardly know about this episode. And so if we would rely exclusively on our professional education and secondary literature, we would never know about it. So this episode was somehow withdrawn from public history. And my question would be, how did it happen? So it's a very important, obviously it's a very important episode of history. So was it done on purpose? Was it withdrawn on purpose? Or did it happen somehow naturally that it kind of filtered and evaporated from public history?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a very important question. And so go ahead, Mr.
So Xenia, right? Correct me if I pronounce it wrong.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you for a very good question, and you highly politicized the question that you brought. No, of course I'm kidding. Yes, it's purposely wiped out from the public reading or even the textbook in school, because remember what's one of the major propagandas from the KMT when they rule over Taiwan by the end of World War II. A decade-long war of resistance against Japanese empire to win back the lost colony ever since the first Sino-Japanese War in 1895. So returning to the motherland for the Taiwan, that's the virtue from this motherland, the mainland China. So the propaganda, of course, that the KMT regime always tried to emphasize was that the anti-Japanese ideology. How can you cooperate with such a former enemy to resist a new common enemy, the Chinese communists, right? Well, the white group's story is not unique in human history, especially in modern history. The post-war American government also hired the pre-war Nazi scientists to help them with the technology, with the satellite or continental missiles or biological technology. But what makes this white group history unique is that the former enemies, that is the ROC, the KMT regime, and the Japanese, the Imperial Japanese officers. Let me rephrase, sorry. The ROC continue such an Imperial Japanese legacy by incorporating or with the existence of the former enemy to reconstruct and to reintroduce the wartime mobilization in the territory, Taiwan, that the new ruler, that is the ROC, had never ruled before the year of 1945. So you are using the experiences from the former colonizer, and you are also known as your former enemy, to help you ruling over or controlling over or to mobilize, militarize the people you had never ruled before. That's what makes this history so unique.
Yeah. I would also say that you are right in saying that very often you have to collaborate with your enemy in order to reach your political aims. For example, if you look at the communist takeover, the communist takeover would have been an episode of several months, maybe, if the communists didn't have the support of former government officers in ruling the country. The same is true, for example, for Afghanistan at this moment, because the Taliban know how to win a war, but they don't necessarily know how to govern a country.
Yeah.
And for that reason, it's not so unique. I think it is a very interesting episode to learn what is very important, I think, nowadays to understand, which is that the morality of politics, which is very often part of the propaganda that all kinds of governments, not only communists, but also non-communist governments, use in order to win legitimacy for themselves, is one pair of shoes, while the other pair of shoes is the necessity of pragmatic and practical policies. So realist policies tell you that, under a situation where you don't have anybody to support you, you might as well go seek your enemy and ask him for support. While, of course, the morality you're teaching your people is the morality that your enemy can only be your enemy. And I think this is especially true for a situation like Taiwan, where so many different forces always meet simultaneously. And even if there is one force in dominance, the other forces are still waiting for their opportunities to come to the surface and exert their influence on what is going on in Taiwan. And so I think, to answer Ms. Hell's question, I would sort of also add the idea that, textbooks are very often made to teach the people. That's why there are textbooks. They're not made to really understand what has been going on in the past. And of course, this collaboration with the enemy is an issue that cannot be easily put into a textbook. But nevertheless, I mean, it's still quite strange to know that this incident, which is so important for understanding the history of China and Taiwan since the Second World War, has been overlooked for such a long time by researchers. So this is actually a key question, what the hell makes them overlook something like this? Of course, I mean, some of these things might have been classified, archives not open, but the Hoover Institution has been there for a long time, right? But I guess, historians only find the things they're looking for. And you're looking for things for different things under different conditions. And I think this is one of the reasons why suddenly this comes up as something, oh, we need to know, we need to understand. Whereas people maybe 20 years, 30 years ago, even though they might have seen your sources, they didn't find them extremely interesting. I think we have one more question. And thank you again for your answer. Yeah, it's again a question by Isabel Cheng saying, you know, it's so interesting. Why is it that people are now interested in this topic? Right. By the way, do you think did you have the feeling, or are you having the feeling while writing on your PhD thesis that your topic is attracting a lot of attention, or do you have to convince your listeners, your supervisors, your committee that this is a good topic?
Yes, first of all, yeah.
I just actually to further qualify that question. Yeah. I thought the previous question posed to Ke-Han is, if I understood it correctly, is that it's not only why this piece of history being hidden, but also why at this moment, in the past 10 or 15 years, it somehow surfaced that now people can or became interested in this issue. And then I found, because the very introduction Ke-Han made just now, such as the documentary of the Project Guang itself is an interest taken not by academics but non-academics to explore this hidden history. And I also personally, I'm sure Ke-Han also has a contact with the so-called local historians, enthusiasts, and a former serviceman. Anyone who has that kind of a piece of the history that related to that forgotten period, either because of father, because of family background, now all came to try to understand this forgotten history. So I was just curious, from Ke-Han's point of view, why at this moment it became something that we can do, can talk about, even present. That's my question, actually.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. So go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Isabel, for a fascinating question. Yes, that to some extent echoes what I addressed in the very end of my talk, is that we hear from this DPP, Minjindang, Democratic Progressive Party, or from President Tsai during the National Day of the speech, addressing that with the emphasis of the post-1949 ROC on Taiwan. However, how many people from Taiwan truly understand what consisted such a post-1949 ROC on Taiwan? And the reason, one of the main reasons why this research, or this I would call it a transnational, trans-war history, including political, diplomatic, and military history, such as Baituan, is just one tiny bit of the whole puzzles. I would say Taiwan now is among the escalation of the tension in the global situation, especially between the largest great powers, America and China. Taiwan now once again are at the crossroad of making decision, I think, sooner or later. But it might be different than the last century situation during the Cold War era. But you might face to some extent similar situation in this East Asian or West Pacific region. But the thing is that, like I said in my conclusion, it's very important for Taiwanese people to start thinking carefully by looking back at the history of what exactly happened in the back in 70 years, how this if you want to call it an accidental state, if I borrow the term from Lin Xiaoting's masterpiece, this de facto independence, which are still lack de jure or the global recognition from major partners in this world global arena, to think about what exactly post-1949 ROC on Taiwan means. From my perspective, by looking at my research, I would argue that the post-1949 ROCAF is a hybridity. It's a hybrid of both American and Japanese features, with the emphasis of the external feature major from mainly from American system, but inner especially the morale or spiritual level or military education, wartime mobilization systems, all those conscription guidelines were highly influenced by Japanese systems. So I think this research, why in the recent decade that more and more post-war historians are becoming more and more popular, more and more people addressed such topics as those critical years by the end of, all the way from the end of World War II to the early years of the Cold War in East Asia. I think the East Asian battlefield during the Cold War period has been long overlooked by the American or European or Western-centric domination of the narration of the whole global Cold War studies. So I think it's time, especially for Taiwanese people, to think how this post-1949 ROC on Taiwan came into the status and the form it is now today. Yeah. And to answer Suzanne's question, yes, both. I personally could feel that a lot of people have a very high interest in my research by keep asking a bunch of questions because they never heard about such a story before. But the second part is more of a challenge for me because I need to convince all different scholars from different fields. I need to convince the modern Chinese historian, modern Japanese historian, a local Taiwanese experts. I always describe by one sentence is that there is a limited size of the door that I need to pass along with my supervisor from Cambridge. If I'm not passing through the door, I won't get my PhD done. But if we both pass by walking straight, facing towards the door, there's no way we can pass through together. It's not only that we find a perfect pose, a gesture in between us, and that takes a lot of effort, hard working, negotiation, conversation, supervisory meetings involving all research things that we will pass through this limited size of a gate. So yeah. Both of them are very the impressions that ever since I began my PhD study in Cambridge.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much for this very open answer to my question. We are sort of hitting the end of this wonderful event. Let me thank you again for sharing so much of your insight with us, and thank you for everybody who participated in the discussion. From my personal point of view, I think that these kind of discussions and presentations are extremely important, not only, as I said at the beginning, for us to understand more about Taiwan, but also for Taiwan itself to actually come up with its own narrative on its own history. I think this is something that has been neglected during the last 20 to 30 years. And I feel that among the people who actually work on Taiwan, the historians are quite rare. Whereas I would say that for Taiwan to find its position in East Asia, it is extremely important to do all kinds of historical research. And to find its position in East Asia means to understand the situation in which Taiwan has been in ever since, right? And my idea is that the really intriguing aspect of doing research on Taiwan consists in the fact that here we have a very complicated historical development, which is so complicated that it does not give you a definite answer on what is right or wrong today. And this is maybe one of the reasons why, you know, people are not so enthusiastic about going into the field of Taiwan research. But at the same time, I think it is so challenging and important to understand that we should not have this idea that here's our history and it gives us a straight answer to, you know, what is right for Taiwan and what's wrong. No, we don't have this right answer. We have to give this answer today, but we have to give an informed answer. And for that answer to be informed, we need to go into studying the history of Taiwan. So thank you very much for your work, Mr. Liao. Thank you very much for everybody for questions. and of course also for your answers, Mr. Liao. And I sure hope that after the pandemic, we will be able to invite you again back to Vienna and to continue our discussions on Taiwan history. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.